Hello guys, welcome back to another video. Have you ever wanted to make a game that works on both console and PC, a multi-platform game? Well, in this video, I will show you guys how you can set up your game to support multi-platform input, whether you're developing your game for the Xbox, PlayStation, or PC, or for all three platforms. This video will show you how to set up new inputs inside of your character blueprint. In this video, we will set up a simple door interaction system that uses blueprint interfaces and showcases a input action widget using the Common UI plugin with enhanced input support inside of Unreal Engine 5.4. If you want to start designing your game to support multi-platform input, this video will give you a great start at showing you everything you need to consider when adding multi-platform input for PC, console, or whatever platform you want to support. Now, before we get into the video, I want to quickly talk about my multiplayer survival game course. I just released a new course on how to make a multiplayer survival game inside of Unreal Engine 5.4. This course covers over how to make a survival game in the latest version of Unreal Engine that features things like an inventory system, harvesting system, different types of weapons and tools, and everything is set up for multi-platform support. So if you want to use input for Xbox or PlayStation controller, or even just keyboard input support. There's lots of stuff that we create in this course, including a open world map, a building system, tribe/clan system, and much more. The course is currently being remastered and re-recorded in Unreal Engine 5.4, but you can get access to the original course that is recorded in 5.0 that has over 250 plus lectures and over 70 hours of course content by simply adding it to your cart at checkout. So go to my website, smartpoly.teachable.com, to check out my Unreal Engine courses and make sure you pick up the multiplayer survival game course, link in the description below. And as always, without further ado, let's get right into the video. So first of all, let's go over to the samples and create a new game animation sample project. So if you search on the Unreal Engine Marketplace for game animation sample, you'll find the sample project. Then you can just click create and create the sample project. Once you have it created, go ahead and open up the project. Okay, so now we're inside of the game animation sample project. So if we actually hit play and test this out, we have a simple character with some motion matching animations. But we want to go ahead and add our interactable object that we can interact with using either our keyboard and mouse or our gamepad controller, whether that is a Xbox or PlayStation controller. So let's go ahead and add that interactable object. So I want to go to your content drawer, and inside of here, we're going to just create a new folder for our assets. You can just name this core for our core assets and double click and open this up. And we're going to create a new blueprint actor. So right click and create a new blueprint class. We want to create a blueprint actor. So select the actor and we'll go ahead and rename this to BP_door. Now for our door, we can double click and open this up. And I'm going to take this window and just dock this up here at the top. We'll need to add a mesh for our door blueprint. So to get a door mesh, we can add starter content to our project. So to add starter content, right click on your content browser. And up here, we can add/import content. We just want to add feature or content pack. So select that. Then we can go ahead and head over to the content and select starter content and click add to project. So that will go ahead and add all the starter content, things like some basic audio, blueprints, maps, materials. We're interested in the props folder because that's where we have this door mesh. So if we head back to our blueprint and door, we're going to really quickly add a new component for our door mesh. So under the components, we can click this plus icon. We want to add a static mesh. So search for static mesh. We have the static mesh component, so select that. And we'll name this to door frame. And then we'll add another static mesh component on top of that. And we'll name this to door. So select the door frame. And in the details, under the static mesh, we can set the door frame mesh. So hit this drop down and search for door frame. And we have this static mesh door frame. So select that. And now we have our door frame. Select the door static mesh components, and in the details, we can hit the drop down and search for door. We have the static mesh door. So select that. Now all we have to do is move this to line this up. So let's go ahead and take the movement gizmo and line it up. And to line it up perfectly, we can turn off the movement snapping. So turn off the grid snapping by clicking on that little icon. And now we can actually move this precisely, like so. And go ahead and compile and save that. So now let's go ahead and set up the logic for interacting with this door blueprint. So the way that we'll set this up is we'll need to head over to the event graph. And we're going to set this up using an interface event. So let's go back to our level here and go to our content folder. And in our core folder, we're going to right click and create a new blueprint interface. And we'll rename this to BPI_interact interface. So we're going to use a blueprint interface for our interaction system. And this will allow us to really interact with any actor that we want to set up. And it's very flexible. It's just the preferred method of doing things. So now that we've created our interact interface, we can actually double click and open up the interface. If you never used interfaces before, this will be really simple. We're going to select this new function. So this function that we get inside of here, we can double click, right click, and rename this to interact event. So we have our interact event. We can go ahead and compile and save that and go back to our BP door. And so to add this interface to our door, all we have to do is go to the class settings, head over to the class settings, and on the details panel down here under the interfaces, under the implemented interfaces, we can hit this drop down to add a new interface. So we want to search for that BPI_interaction interface. And now that we have that implemented, if you expand this, we can now see that we have that BPI interaction interface implemented. Now what you also know is under this interfaces, we have this new interact event. So if I double click on this interact event, it will add that interact event, the one that we created in our BPI interact interface. So whenever we interact with this object, this interact event will be called. So now we have an event to set up the logic for our interaction for our door. So in our case, when we interact with this door, what we want to do is we want to take this door mesh and rotate it 90 degrees, like so, to open or close the door. So in the event graph, off of this event, interact event, we're going to do a flip flop. So we'll do a flow control flip flop. And what that will do is every time we interact with the door, it will either open or close the door. So we'll sort of flip flop between opening and closing the door. Then off of the A, we want to do a timeline. So we want to search for the add timeline node. So the timeline node will allow us to actually open and close the door or rotate this door mesh back and forth. So with this timeline node, we want to actually open this up. So we double click, that will open up the timeline node up here. So you can see we have the event graph and the timeline. Now in this timeline, we want to add a new track. So under the track, you can click on the plus icon and we want to add a float track. So what this float track will allow us to do is it will allow us to output a value that we can use for the door's rotation. So this will be sort of like a graph. So first we can right click anywhere on the graph to add a key to this graph. So we want to add a key to float curve 0. And with that key, we can set the time and a value. Now for this key that we added, we can select it and set it to 0 and 0. And it should put our pin down here at 0, 0. Then we want to right click anywhere else on the graph and add another key. And you can see that it adds a line between those two keys. Now we want to select this key over here that we've added. Then we want to set the time to 2 seconds and the value to 90. Now we want to hit these two zoom icons. So zoom to fit horizontal, zoom to fit vertical. And now we should see our 2 points on this graph. We want to adjust the length of this timeline. So up here at the length, we want to change this from 5 down to 2 for 2 seconds. And then we want to select both points by hitting shift and selecting, by dragging and selecting. And we want to right click and set this to auto. So that will add a auto smooth between the two values. So essentially what this timeline will do is we'll output a value. At 0 seconds, the value will be 0. At 1 second, the value will be 45 degrees. And at 2 seconds, the value will be 90 degrees. So it will slowly output this value. You can see the value slowly increasing all the way from 0 to 90 degrees. So if we compile and save, we can head back to our event graph. And now you can see that this timeline is outputting this track 0 value, which we're going to use to rotate the door mesh. Now we actually want to take this A and plug this pin into play from start. So we can hold down the Alt and left click to disconnect the pin. So just click Alt and left click. We want to hook up the A to play from start and the B to reverse from end. So that will go ahead and open the door in the beginning. And if you want to close it, it will reverse from end. Now for the rotation of the door mesh, we want to get our door mesh component. So select that and drag and drop it on the graph. That will go ahead and get it. And then we can actually set the rotation of this mesh by using the set rotation node. So drag up here and search for set relative rotation. And we can use the set relative rotation node. Now for this, we want to hook up the execution. So for the update, we'll hook up a pin like so. And for the new rotation, we want to take this track and we only want to rotate this door on the Z axis. Because the Z axis, if we select the door and press E, you can see that the Z axis, this blue color, will rotate the door like so. So we know that we want to rotate it on the Z. So we can drag off here and do a make rotator. So we want to use this make rotator node. We want to hook up this float value into the Z because we only want to modify the Z rotation. So now compile and save that. And now we have our basic interact logic for opening and closing our door. So really all that we're doing is when we call this interact interface on this blueprint, we're going to either open or close the door, which will either play from start this timeline or play from reverse, which will essentially update the rotation of this door mesh, and it will rotate either 90 degrees open or 90 degrees closed like so. So now that we have this interface set up, all we need to do is set up the input for our character so that when they press either the E key or the X on the Xbox controller, whatever key or input that we assign, we want to essentially call the interface on this blueprint door if the player is near or close to the door. So the way that we'll set this up is, first things first, we want to go to our content core and actually drag this door into our level so that we can have it in the level. So what we want to set up is when we hit play and run up to the door, we want to add an input that will allow us to press E and open the door. Also, one thing you'll notice is the door, currently we can actually just run through it. So we'll need to add a collision to the door mesh. So first things first, let's actually fix that collision with the door mesh. So the way that we'll fix that is by heading over to the starter content, props, open up the static mesh door. So this will open up the door mesh. And under the collision, we can just add a box simplified collision. And I'm going to select this box and press R. And I'm going to take this and scale this down. And we can actually turn off the scale snapping. Or we can just scale this down so that it lines up with our door mesh. And then just hit save. And now if we go back to our level and hit play, if I run up to the door mesh, you can see that we can no longer run through the door mesh because it has a collision. So let's set up our interaction system. So we'll need to add our input for our interaction. So if you never added your own inputs, essentially you want to go to your content input folder. And you can see that we already have some basic inputs for our character that come included in this project. So we want to add a new input for interaction. We actually already have a interact input action, and this is already set up for us. So all we need to do is add this to our input mapping. But if you are doing this in a new project, you can right click and add a new input of the type input action and just rename that to IA interact, and then double click the input action interact. And under the triggers, you can add a new trigger and set this to pressed, like so. So once you've gone ahead and done that and added that interact input action, you want to open up the input mapping context. Every project will have an input mapping context. If you're using the third-person blueprint or first-person blueprint, you want to open up the input mapping context and expand the mappings. And in here, you want to add that interact, IA interact. So you can click on this plus icon and set the input action interact. And then for the input, you can add a new input by clicking this plus icon and click this drop down and search for the E key. Now we'll go ahead and add the E key. And for our controller, you want to search for the gamepad face button. I'm actually going to change this to the gamepad face button left. So if you hit the drop down, I want to search for gamepad face button left. So the gamepad face button left is the X button on the Xbox controller, or on the PlayStation controller, it's the square button. So that'll be different depending on what controller you're using. So just note that that is the same button for whichever controller that you're using. It's just the button on the left of the gamepad. So now that we've added these inputs for our interact, we have the two input keys for our interaction. We can now add our interaction event inside of our character blueprint. So if you go to your content blueprints, we can open up the character blueprint. So this character blueprint sandbox character, double click, open that up, and head over to the event graph. And you can see we have some basic inputs, things like our interact move, look, walk, sprint, jump, crouch, which actually isn't implemented yet. But we want to add our interaction interface. So if we right click, we want to search for our IA_interact. And we have this enhance action events, IA interact. So we can go ahead and add that on the graph. And in here, we're going to basically add some simple interaction. So we're going to do a trace to see if there's an object in front of the character that we can actually interact with. And if there is an object in front of the character that we can interact with, we're going to call that interact interface on that object. The way that we'll do that is off of this triggered, we'll call a sphere trace by channel. So we have this sphere trace by channel node. And what that will do is we need to specify where a location, where to start our trace, and that will output what we actually hit. Okay, if we hit something, and what is it? So for our start and end location, we can just get actor location, get actor location, get the location of our character. We can plug that in for the start and for the end. For the radius, we can set this to 100. And we can go ahead and draw a debug sphere. So under this draw debug type, we can do for duration. And then if we actually hit something off of this return value, we can do a branch. So this true will only get fired if we actually hit an object. And for the out hits, we want to take this out hit result and break the hit result. So that will return what we actually hit. So if you hit this down arrow, that will give us things like the impact location and the hit actor. So if we hit an actor, we'll return the reference to that actor that we hit right here. Now that's good because now off of this hit actor, we can call our interface our interact event message, or our interface. So if we select that, we can hook up the execution for our true, and we can go ahead and actually unexpand that hit result. Because all we want to do is we just want to, if we actually hit something, we want to check and see if that hit actor implements our interface. And if it does, we'll call our interact event interface on that hit actor. So in our case, we'll call this interact event on this door, which we'll call this interface event, which will play the timeline to open or close the door. Let's go back to our character blueprint and compile and save this. And we can actually add a comment for this. This will be our interact logic. And now we should be able to actually test this out. So we'll go ahead and hit play. I can run up to this door and press E. You can see that it draws a sphere trace. So it does a trace. If I press E over here, you can see that it doesn't hit anything. It actually does hit something like the floor. But if I go up to the door, if I press E, you can see that it hits the door mesh and it calls that interact interface on the door, which opens or closes the door based on if the door is open or closed. So now we have our basic interaction logic, and this will work for both the keyboard and mouse inputs as well as controller. So to actually test out your controller, you want to go ahead and hook up your controller, and you should see in the bottom left a input device has been added. So this will work best if you use a Xbox controller. So you should see an input device has been connected in the bottom right. And now that we have connected it, we can use the Xbox controller to move around, jump around. And if I run up to the door and press X, you can see I can use the X button to interact with the door. Now, what we want to do in this tutorial to wrap things up is we want to set up a simple interaction widget that will show us the input based on the platform that we're using or the input that we're using. So if we're using a keyboard and mouse, we want to show that the interact key is E to interact or open this door. Or if we're using a Xbox controller, if we're on an Xbox, we want to show that the interact key is X. So to set that up, we're going to be using the common UI plugin as well as the enhanced input system. So we'll need to go ahead and enable those plugins to use those features. So we want to go to Edit, Plugins, and you want to search for Common UI. And you want to go ahead and enable the Common UI plugin. You'll see that it is in beta. So we'll click Yes. And it's going to ask us to restart our project. And let's go ahead and just click Restart Now to restart our project. So now that we've restarted our project, we want to actually go back into our project settings. So go to Edit, Project Settings. And in here, we want to search for Enhanced Input. And we should have this Game Common Input Settings now that we have that Common UI plugin enabled. And we want to click the checkbox here for Enable Enhanced Input Support. So this will allow us to bind input actions to our input widgets, or say, for example, our interact key. We want to bind that to our input action interact. That way, whenever the player rebinds the key, say they want to rebind the interact key to F or to tab or to whatever key they want, it will also update the widget associated with that input action. So you want to make sure that you enable that and click Restart Now. And now that we've made those following changes, we enabled the Common UI plugin and we enabled the Enhance Input Support. We can now start setting up our Interact widget. So let's go to our core folder. This is where we're setting up all of our logic. And in here, I'm going to right click and create a new folder for Common UI. And we want to double click and open this up. And inside here, I'm going to right click and create a new folder for images. And then double click and open this up. We can right click and add a new folder and name this for keyboard and mouse. And also right click and create a new folder, and we can name this to Xbox One. And if you wanted to add icons for the PlayStation, you can add a PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4. Depends on what platform that you want to support. But I have my two input folders here. We have keyboard and mouse and the Xbox One controller. So now we're going to import an icon for our keyboard mouse, our Xbox One. So we want to head over to the description of this video and download the icons. So we have this interact keyboard icon, which is the E key, and then we have the Xbox X button for our interaction for our Xbox controller. Now with your project side by side, you want to take and open up the keyboard mouse folder and drag and drop the interact keyboard.png, and then go back and go to the Xbox One folder and drag and drop the X button icon like so. I will go ahead and import the following icons. And then you just want to open up the icon, and we want to set the texture group from world to UI. So that will go ahead and set the texture group so that the engine knows that this is for our user interface. Save that, close out of there, and go back to the keyboard mouse, open up the interact keyboard. Do the same thing, set the texture group to UI like so. Save that and close out of there. So now we've imported our interact icon for our keyboard mouse and our interact icon for our Xbox One. So now that we've added those inputs, we want to go to our common UI folder. And in here, we need to bind those icons to the keys to the inputs. So the way that we'll use that is we'll need to create a new blueprint class that will bind those icons that we just imported to those specific keys. So for example, this E interact, this needs to be bound to the E key. So whenever we use a input action that uses the E key, this texture will be shown for our interaction. So in our common UI folder, we want to right click and create a new blueprint class. And we actually want to hit the drop down for all classes. And in here, we want to search for a common input base controller data. So we have this common input base controller data. So if we select that, that will add that blueprint class, and we want to rename this to common input underscore keyboard mouse. So we have our common input keyboard mouse, and then we want to right click and duplicate this and name this to common input underscore Xbox One. So we have our common input keyboard mouse and our common input Xbox One. So do a file save all. And now we want to go ahead and open up our common input keyboard mouse. And if we actually dock this here at the top, we're only interested in the details over here. Actually, if we close out of this and open this again, you'll see that it'll open up just the details. And so we just need to set the following variables inside of here. Now, currently you can see that this common input keyboard mouse is assigned to the mouse and keyboard. So we don't need to set any information over here. But down here under the input brush map data, this is actually what we need to focus on. So if I hit this plus icon for a new input brush data map, we'll add a new index. So if I expand this, it will allow us to specify a key and a key brush. So for the key, we want to click this drop down and we want to search for the E key. So type in E, and we want to scroll down till we find the E key like so. So we want to specify which key, and then we want to specify the key brush. So for our key brush, we can set the image. So if you hit this drop down, we want to search for our interact keyboard 02. So now we have the key, which is E. Now we have the icon for our E icon. So basically what this common input base controller data, all you're doing is you're adding the keys that you want to have icons for. So you could add E, you could add W, ASD, you can add the left mouse button. You want to add the keys and the key brushes or the icons associated to that key. All this blueprint is mapping those inputs to icons like so. Compile and save, and that's all we need to do inside of here. You could add even more inputs by hitting the plus icon, and you could add more inputs and icons associated with those inputs by just adding more elements. But now that we've added this simple key, we want to do the same thing for our Xbox One, common input Xbox One. So double click and open this one up and dock this here at the top. Now for this one, we're going to change this from mouse and keyboard. Since this is not a mouse and keyboard, we want to set this to a gamepad. So for our Xbox One, this will be a gamepad. And now we need to specify some basic information about the gamepad. So under the none, we want to change this to generic. And for the display name, we'll name this to Xbox controller. And gamepad category, we can name this to wireless controller. And for the platform name, this will be Xbox One. So this information is just based on the platform you're going to support and the controller name and all that stuff. And then for the hardware ID mapping, we want to add an element here. And for this is actually very important because this is what the engine uses to determine whether or not you have the Xbox controller hooked up. So for the input device name, this is very specific to the Xbox controller. You can actually look this up. But for this, we type in I input. So capital X and I, X input interface. So you want to make sure that you have the proper capitalization. And then for the hardware device identifier, this will be X input controller. So you want to make sure that you have X input interface and X input controller. And now that we have those hardware ID mapping, the engine should note that this is a Xbox controller. So when I plug in the Xbox One controller, it should automatically determine that this is the Xbox controller, and it will use this common base input controller data. So now we want to do the same exact thing that we did in our keyboard mouse. We want to, under the input brush map data, we want to add a new element, expand that. We just want to add the same input that we have for our interaction. So in our case, we use the gamepad face button left. So remember, we use the face button left for our interact. And for the key brush, we expand this. For the Xbox, we want to search for our T_X Box 1X texture. So this is the X button texture that we imported. And so now we have the input, our face button left, which is the X button. for the Xbox controller, and then we have the actual brush, the icon associated with that button. So just like the keyboard, we have the E key and the icon associated. For the Xbox, we have the X button and the icon associated with that. So compile and save that. You can add even more inputs. So if you wanted to add the face button top, bottom, or left, which is the X, Y, B, or A buttons, you could add icons for those as well. But just to keep this simple, we're just adding one input inside of here. But now we can close out of those blueprints. We just need to set these up in our project settings. So go to your Edit, Project Settings, and you want to search for Controller. And under the Game Common Input Settings, you want to go down to Input, Platform Input. So for our platform input, we're going to set this up for Windows. You could also set this up, I believe, for Mac and Linux. But for Windows, we're going to add the controller data. And essentially, we need to click the Add Element and assign those blueprints that we created. So we want to add 2 of these. And for the first one, that will be our common input Xbox One. And for the second one, this will be our common input keyboard mouse. So depending on the inputs for the different controllers that you want to support, you want to add them in here. That will tell the engine that you're using those inputs. So if you're having one set up for the PlayStation 5 controller or PlayStation 4, you want to add those elements and assign it inside of here. So now that we have that set up in our project settings, it should use those blueprints. And now the engine should know that this E key is assigned to this brush icon. So now we can actually use that to set up an icon for our door interaction system. So the way that we'll do that is in our core folder, we're going to create a new user widget for our interaction icon. So we want to right click and we actually want to create a blueprint class. So we want to create this blueprint class and we need to search for the common action widget. So we need to add this common action widget. So this widget shows a platform specific icon for the given input action. So we need to add one of these. That way we can use this to show the input action icon. So select that and we want to actually rename this to input action widget and do a file and save all. And now that we've created that, we want to create a widget blueprint that will use this widget inside of it. So to create a widget blueprint, we want to right click and add a new user interface widget blueprint. And we just want to select the user widget up here. And we'll rename this to our W for widget underscore interact widget. So we created our interact widget. This is the widget that will show up. That will say press E to interact. So double click, open this up. And inside here, if you've never used user interface before, we're just going to keep this very simple. We're going to add a vertical box in our palette and drag and drop that onto our hierarchy. And with this vertical box selected, we want to add a horizontal box onto that vertical box like so. And then inside that horizontal box, we need to add a text. So search for text, add a text into that horizontal box. And in that text, we want to select that and rename the text over here to press. And I'm going to change some of the style. So for the text, I'm going to, under the font, expand this. I'm going to change the font size to 24. And I'm also going to add an outline. So under this outline settings, you can set the outline size to 2. That way it has this black outline. Then we can copy and paste that again. And then we want to select this other text over here and rename this to interact. So we have press to interact. So these are 2 separate texts. And then in between that, we want to add the input action widget. So we want to first add a size box, search for size box and add that into our horizontal box. We want to make sure that that is in the center. So you want to drag and drop it right here in the center. So we should have our press text size box to interact. And And then with this size box selected, we want to add a width and height override of 40 by 40 pixels. So it should be a box like this. So compile and save that. And then we actually want to select the text, press text, and set this to left align horizontally and center align vertically. So the text should be centered like so. So set the alignment. And then you want to scroll down until you find this justification, and you want to align the text right like so. Then you want to select this to interact text. And for this, we want to set this to fill horizontally, fill vertically, and also make sure that the justification is set like so. Okay, so compile and save. And actually, let's set this to center align vertically. That way it'll be centered up. Now that we have that added, we want to select the size box. Inside of the size box, we want to add that input action widget. So this blueprint that we created. So you want to search in the palette for input action widget, and we should have this input action widget. So you want to make sure that you named it like so, and you saved it. That way it'll show up in here. And if it shows up in here, now you can drag and drop and add it into that size box. And what you should see is the size box automatically compresses. So we can't see the size box. Now it's this little square rectangle right here. And now we can select the input action widget. And with this input action widget selected, we want to set the input associated with this input action widget. So down here in the details, we should now see this enhance input action. And so we want to bind this input action widget to the input action for our interact input action. So if you hit the drop down, we can search for IA_interact. So we have this IA interact input action. So now that we've added that input action interact, it should show the interact input widget, which is E for keyboard and mouse, or X for the Xbox controller. So compile and save that. And now we can close out of this interact widget. And all we have to do now is add that interact widget to our door blueprint. So open up our BP door and head over to the viewport. And we want to add a new component. So under the components, click the plus icon and search for widget. We want to add a new widget component. So that will add a widget. And select that component. And we want to, in the details, set that widget class. So under the widget class, you want to hit the drop down and search for the W_interact widget that we just created. So now you can see it says press to interact. And we actually want to change this from a world widget to a screen widget. So changing it to a screen widget will make it disappear like so. And then also we want to change a couple of settings like the draw size. So we want to set this to 100 by 100 for our draw size. And we're actually going to take this and move this in the center of our door. So compile and save. And now if we go ahead and hit play, we should be able to see that press E to interact. If we run up to it, so it says press E to interact. I press E, open the door, press E, close it. Now if I change to my Xbox controller, if I hook up my Xbox controller, what you're going to see automatically is it changes the input button depending on the input that I have set up. So if I have an Xbox controller, it now says press X to interact. If I go back to my keyboard and mouse, you can see that it changes automatically. It automatically detects what input you are using, and it will automatically update the input icon depending on the input that you have set up. So if I'm using the keyboard and mouse, it says press E. I can press E. If I'm using the Xbox controller, it will say press X. So I can press X. Now we'll go ahead and open or close the door. Now one last thing that I want to add is I want to go ahead and hide this widget depending on how close I am. So if I'm right up near the door, we want to show the widget. If I'm far away, we want to hide the widget. That way it's not automatically shown on the screen like this. So the way that we'll do that is we'll add some basic logic to hide or show the widget. So we're going to open up our BPI interact interface. And in our interact interface, we're going to add a new function. So click on this plus icon, add a new function. That will add a new interface function. And we're going to right click and rename this to show interact widget. And we want to add a new function and rename this to hide interact widget. So we'll either show or hide the widget And now we have those interface events. So we can compile and save that and head over to our door blueprint, head over to the event graph, and we can add those new interface events. So if you expand the interfaces, we have the show and hide interact widget. So double click on that. That will add that interface event. We have hide interact widget and we have show interact widget. So for our show interact widget, all we need to do is take our widget component. So we want to get that on the graph. We want to set visibility to visible. So you want to hit the checkbox for visible. And then for this, we want to copy and paste this. For our hide interact widget, we want to set this visibility to invisible. So you want to uncheck this checkbox right here. Lastly, you want to select the widget component. You want to search for visibility in the details. And by default, we want to uncheck this visible. That way it's hidden by default. So you want to make sure that you do that for the widget and then compile and save that. And now in our character blueprint, we want to go to our content, blueprints, open up our character blueprint, sandbox character. We want to go to our viewport and add a sphere around our character so that if we get close to that object we want to interact with, we'll go ahead and show the widget or hide it depending on if we're close or far away. So under the components, we want to search for a sphere collision, and select that sphere. We'll rename this to interact sphere. Select this and scale this up. So we can scale it up like so and compile and save that. And in the event graph, we want to select that interact sphere and scroll down in the details. We want to add a event begin overlap. So that will add a event begin overlap. We want to select the interact sphere and add a on component end overlap. So we should have a event begin overlap, an event end overlap. Then all we have to do is check and see if that other actor, the actor that we hit, does implement interface. And the interface is our BPI underscore interact interface. So we want to do a branch. We want to check and see if the actor that we're overlapping with implements our interaction interface. And if it does, off of this other actor, we can call that show interact widget message. Look that up for the true. The same exact thing down here. We want to check and see if the other actor does implement interface. Does it implement our BPI underscore interact interface? Do a branch. Look up the execution. So if it does, then if we are ending overlap, we want to go ahead and hide interact widget. So basically, if we are overlapping with it, begin overlap, want to check and see if it implements the interface. If it does, we want to show the widget. And then if we end overlap with that object, we want to check and see if it implements our interface, interactable. If so, we want to hide the interact widget. So we'll call those interface events inside of our door. We'll set the visibility to visible or hidden for our widget component. Now let's go ahead and compile and save, hit play. So now we can't see that interaction widget, but if we run up close enough to the door, you can see it says press E to interact. I run away, it's not shown. But now I can press E, interact with the door, open and close. And if I switch to my Xbox, you can see that it either hides or show that interact widget. I can press X to interact with the door like so. So that is pretty much it for this tutorial. We showed you how you can set up multi-platform input support, whether that is for the Xbox controller or for keyboard and mouse, and how you can show the input action widget associated with those inputs, as well as a basic door interaction system. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments down below, what other types of tutorials or videos you want to see. And yeah, that is pretty much it for this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one.